Well, it's always good when the guy who's losing his voice finds out he has more time. Excuse me. This morning I mentioned it was going to be a real hee-haw of a sermon, and I got some raised eyebrows at that. Well, the reason why is because we're going to be talking about Numbers 22 and the story of Balaam and his donkey. So if you would be turning in your Bibles to the book of Numbers, Numbers chapter 22 will be where our lesson comes from this evening. And I mentioned it briefly beforehand, but apparently Mark did not find any songs about talking donkeys in the songbook. Another oversight, I guess. We haven't written any hymns on the subject very much, so perhaps that's something to think about in the future. The book of Numbers is primarily about Israel's experiences in the wilderness, and mainly centers around 3 geographic locations that they go to. The first part of Numbers, they're at Mount Sinai, where God gave them the law, and the first part of Numbers is God giving them even more laws, and mostly about how they're supposed to move the camp and set up the camp and all this other stuff. And finally, in Numbers chapter 10, they set out and they go off into the wilderness. They travel for a little bit. In the second part of the story of Numbers, they're in Kadesh Barnea and then the wilderness. They come to Kadesh Barnea and they say, the Lord says, okay, send spies into the promised land. And they send spies into the promised land and they come back. Most of the spies say, oh yeah, it's a good land. Well, all the spies say it's a good land. Most of the spies say we can't take it because there's giants living in the land. And there's only 2 faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb, who say we can take it. And because Israel has this funny idea that the majority of people were right about things, they listen to the 10 spies instead of the 2, and as a result, Israel doesn't want to enter the promised land, and the Lord says, well fine, you can die in the wilderness. So they have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years before that entire generation dies off and the next generation can go into the promised land. It's not a very happy story. So that's the second phase in the story of Numbers. And the third phase, which is given the least amount of treatment by people, I think, but it's also funny because it's the longest section in the book of Numbers, is the time that they spend in the plain of Moab. And it's really kind of towards the end of that 40 years. And towards the end of that 40 years, what happens in Numbers chapter 21, they come to the area that's just east of the promised land, just east of the Jordan River, and they fight some of the nations there, Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan, and they defeat them. And at about that time, they camp in the plain of Moab, and that's the place where God gives them some more laws, and in fact, that's the place where the book of Deuteronomy is kind of, is the speeches that the book of Deuteronomy was based on were given there. That's the place from which Moses eventually went up on Mount Nebo and saw the promised land from a distance before he died. But all this to say, this section of Israel's time spent in the plain of Moab begins with an outside perspective. In Numbers chapter 22 and 23 and 24, we have a lengthy story about Balaam, a prophet who is summoned by Moab to curse the Israelites. Now, we're not going to cover all of Numbers 22 through 24 tonight because it's long, and because even though I have extra time, I don't have that much extra time. But I think it's important to understand this up front. In the book of Numbers, Israel is portrayed very negatively. In Numbers 11, they're complaining about manna and demanding meat, and God sends them so much quail that it comes out their noses. In Numbers 13 and 14, they refuse to enter the promised land out of fear of giants. In Numbers 16, you have Korah's rebellion against Moses and Aaron. In Numbers 20, you have the people gathered at the rock of Meribah saying, we're sick of the fact that you've dragged us out in this wilderness to die of thirst. And in Numbers 21, the people, having been provided with manna and quail all those years, now have the audacity to say to Moses, we're sick of the manna, we want something different, we want to go back to Egypt, and on which occasion God sent fiery serpents among them to bite the people and kill them. So Israel's not portrayed very positively throughout the book of Numbers. That's a pretty consistent image. But But Numbers 22 and onward, there's an outsider perspective. And in Numbers 22, we learn something about what God is doing with Israel and how, even in spite of all their flaws, in spite of all their wrongdoings, God considers them blessed. Balaam is not permitted to curse Israel because, in God's words, they are a blessed people. And I'm not going to let you curse a people that I've said is going to be blessed. And so that's one thing that's kind of important to see here. The main story of these chapters is how these foreigners conspire from the outside to destroy Israel, but God circumvents that conspiracy. And in fact, really, it's a fulfillment of a long ago promise that was once made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 in verses 1 through 3, where the Lord told Abraham, and I want to focus specifically on verse 3, I will bless those who bless you. The one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Another thing that's important to remember about the story of Balaam is, especially chapter 22, but it's true for the rest of the section as well, the story of Balaam is meant to be funny. It's an ancient attempt at humor. The problem is, of course, that when humor happens in the Bible, we don't always get that it's humor because of translation. And so that's a problem. And thus, of course, that has not stopped other humorous spin-off sermons on Balaam. And I will refrain, at my wife's request, I will refrain from making any puns on the King James word for donkeys. But this is the book of Numbers 22. We're talking about Balaam and the situation here. It's clear that the donkey is the smartest person in the story. And that's not good for Balaam's perspective at all. And we're going to see that in a minute. The story, it's really good, actually. There's a lot of threefold repetition. The donkey tries to avoid the angel 3 times. Balaam strikes the donkey 3 times. There's 3 sets of sacrifices in chapter 23. There's 3 encounters with God. Israel gets blessed 3 times in chapter 24. All 3 major characters are explicitly said to get angry at some point in the story. So we also need to ask, before we even begin that, also asking who these people are. Balak is the king of Moab. But who's Balaam? Well, Balaam was a prophet of Yahweh, the true God. But Balaam is a bit odd in that he's not an Israelite at all. He's a foreigner. And he has a reputation. This isn't the only time he's prophesied, apparently. And we know he's a prophet of Yahweh because throughout the text, he uses the word Yahweh again and again and again to refer to God. Everybody else, the narrator's using Elohim throughout. The narrator's just using a generic word for God. But he uses the personal name of God that we see when we read about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the rest of the Old Testament. The prophet is clearly known to the surrounding pagans. And actually, he's even mentioned in some extra biblical history, which is kind of cool. But although it's very, very late references to him, long after these events take place. What we know about Balaam, though, is not just who he was by reputation among the pagans, but who he becomes by reputation in the New Testament. The New Testament has nothing good to say about Balaam at all. He is the prototypical false prophet. And he becomes trapped in this story, as we're going to see, between the commands of God and the demands of Balak. Alright, so let's go ahead and read what's going on here. Numbers 22. So the sons of Israel journeyed and camped in the plains of Moab, beyond the Jordan opposite Jericho, verse 1. That signals that we're beginning that section where they've now moved to Moab. Verse 2, Now Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. So Moab was in great fear because of the people, for they were numerous, and Moab was in dread of the sons of Israel. Moab said to the elders of Midian, Now this horde will lick up all that is around us, as the ox licks up the grass of the field. And Balak, the son of Zippor, was king of Moab at the time. So he sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor, at Pethor, which is near the river, in the land of the sons of his people, to call him, saying, Behold, a people came out of Egypt. Behold, they cover the surface of the land, and they are living opposite me. Now therefore, please come, curse this people for me, since they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I may be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. For I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. Balak saw what Israel had done to the Amorites. He saw in chapter 21 how Israel had destroyed Sihon, the king of the Amorites, a feared leader in that region. He saw how they had destroyed Og, king of Bashan, a man who was so large that his coffin would have been 14 feet long. It's described as 14 feet long in one place. And so Moab sees Israel's a force to be reckoned with. Something has to be done, or else my claim in this region is going to be next. And since Balak is the king of Moab, Moab is now terrified of what Israel's going to do to them. We learn in verse 4 that the Midianites are also in on this. And sometimes it's just Moab that's mentioned, and sometimes it's just Midian that's mentioned. But the Moabites and the Midianites are colluding on this thing together. And they collude on it together even later in chapter 25. And then when Israel goes to war against them in chapter 31, because of all the bad stuff they're doing. But it is interesting to note, of course, that Moab and Midian were both vessels of Sihon, the king of the Amorite. Vassals of Sihon, the king of the Amorite. They were servants to him. So when their lord just gets cut down, well, what's going to happen? Is Israel going to become our new master? Or maybe we should try to become the masters of our own in this region? Well, we'll see how that works out for them. The Midianites are afraid of Israel's going to lick them up like an ox licks up grass. Kind of an interesting image in and of itself. Balak gets the idea of summoning the prophet Balaam. And because Balaam has this reputation, whoever he curses is cursed, and whoever he blesses is blessed. How do you get that reputation? Such a thing would not be possible without the hand of God being involved. This man is a prophet of the true God. Balaam lives near the river, and in this case the word there is actually the river Perath, or as we would translate it, the Euphrates River, located in modern-day Iraq. So he's kind of in that Babylon, Assyria region. So in verses 7 through 14, they go to Balaam. The elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed with the feast for divination in their hand. They came to Balaam and repeated Balak's words to him. And he said to them, "Spend the night here, and I will bring word back to you, as the Lord may speak to me." And the leaders of Moab stayed with Balaam. And God came to Balaam and said, "Who are these men with you?" Balaam said to God, "Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, has sent word to me. Behold, there's a people who came out of Egypt, and they cover the surface of the land. Now come, curse them for me. Perhaps I may be able to fight against them and drive them out." God said to Balaam, "Do not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed." So Balaam arose in the morning and said to Balak's leaders, "Go back to your land, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you." And the leaders of Moab arose and went to Balak and said, "Balaam refused to come with us." There the story should have ended. Now, they came with a gift to Balaam, verse 7, which was not out of the ordinary. It was very common in the Old Testament for prophets to receive fees or gifts for some kind of inquiry that was made of them. I mean, you might think of 1 Samuel chapter 9, for instance. Whenever Saul goes to see the prophet Samuel, there's a big conversation about, what kind of gift are we going to offer to him when we get there. 1 Kings chapter 14, Jeroboam sends his wife to go see Abijah, although he sends her deceitfully, but he sends her with a gift. And 2 Kings chapter 8, when Ben-Hadad goes to see Elisha, or rather he sends his messenger to Elisha, Hazael, he sends him with a gift to inquire whether he will get better. So, this was a pretty common thing. They go with their gift in hand. Balaam goes ahead and says, "Wait overnight, I'll inquire of Yahweh." He explains the situation to God. God asks, "Who are these men with you?" as if he doesn't know. Balaam explains that they're envoys of Balak, king of Moab, and they want me to come curse this people that I've never heard of that came out of the land of Egypt. Balaam doesn't know who they are. Doesn't appear to anyway. And God says, "Well, no, you can't curse that people because I say they're blessed. That's my covenant people there." And so Balaam is explicitly forbidden with going Balak's men and cursing Israel. Balaam's refusal, the next morning he goes to the men and he says, "Yahweh won't let me go with you." And so they go back to Balak and they report this. And that should have been the end of the story right there, right? But, Balak doesn't like the word no. He doesn't like to take no for an answer. So he decides to try again, verses 15 through 20. Balak again sent leaders more numerous and more distinguished than the former. They came to Balaam and said to him, "Thus says Balak the son of Zippor, let nothing, I beg you, hinder you from coming to me. For I will indeed honor you richly, and I will do whatever you say to me. Please come then, curse this people for me." Balaam replied to the servants of Balak, "Though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not do anything either small or great, contrary to the command of the Lord my God." Let's stop there for a minute. Verse 18, again, the story could have ended right here and everything would have been good. Right here at verse 18. But I think things start to go wrong in verse 19. "Now, please, you also stay here tonight, and I will find out what else the Lord will speak to me." There we go. God came to Balaam at night and said to him, "If these men have come to call you, rise up and go with them. Only the word which I speak you shall do." Now, I want to talk about what happens here. Balak sends more leaders, more distinguished leaders. "Let nothing prevent you from coming to me," he says. "I'll give you great riches. I'll give you anything you want. Anything, name it at all, you can have it." That's pretty big. You know, what if I want to be king? Oh, probably not that. Balak's second offer, you don't want to curse Israel. Well, what if we give you a whole lot of money? Because that's what this boils down to. And Balaam's answer, Balaam gets one thing right and one thing wrong. Verse 18 is what he gets right. He says, "I can't do anything contrary to God's command. Even if you give me all the money you got, I couldn't do it." But verse 19 is what he gets wrong. Let's see if God will change his mind. Now, why is that wrong? Here's my theory that it's wrong might seem to be a little circumvented by what happens in verse 20. Because in verse 20, God says, "Oh, go with them." God changed his mind. Suddenly, God cares so much about Balaam's financial well-being. "Oh, Balaam, just go with those men." I'm being asked to curse this people. You can't do that. They're blessed. "Oh, but they're offering me a whole lot of money. Can I go now?" "Fine, go." Really? Is that how we're going to read that story? Is God okay with what's going on here? Does God change his mind in the Bible? Well, there's places in the Bible where he does. We can think of Hezekiah's illness, Isaiah 38. You can think of Jonah and the Ninevites in Jonah chapter 3. You can think of when Israel built the golden calf and God said, "I'm going to destroy you." And Moses begged and pleaded with God not to destroy them, and God changed his mind. The Bible says God changes his mind in several places. In fact, Jeremiah has a whole chapter in Jeremiah 18 devoted to the kind of situation in which God might change his mind. For people who say God never changes his mind, that's false doctrine. That's not true. Did God change his mind with Balaam? Well, that's different. God didn't change what he was planning to do with Israel. He still plans to bless them. And as we read in chapters 23 and 24, it becomes clear that yes, he does intend to bless Israel. Balaam still winds up being forbidden to curse Israel. And, why would God care so deeply about Balaam's financial situation, especially when he's not planning to give him anything? And in fact, I think the great irony in all of this it is later out of the mouth of Balaam himself that these words come. In Numbers 23 and verse 19, "God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should repent. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not make it good?" Then that was when Balak had asked Balaam to curse Israel once. He blessed Israel instead. He took him to another place and said, "Well, maybe it'll be different here." He asked him to curse Israel again, and Balaam said that. God's not going to change his mind. He's going to keep doing this. And then he proceeds to bless Israel a second time. Who is susceptible to bribes in this story? It's not God. God's not being bought off because they offered Balaam a whole lot of money. No. And in fact, Balaam is tipping his hand about his own character here. Because in verse 18, he claims not to care about money. But, on the other hand, what other motive does the man have to ask God to change his mind? What other motive does he have? God said no. I'm not going to violate the command of the Lord. But let me see if I can... let me see if I can just sort of, go and see if God says anything else. Anything else? Well, what motive could there be for that? It's not because of some deep compassion, some difficult situation Moab is in. No. It's about dollars and cents. Or in this case, shekels, minas and shekels, I guess, in their case. This is a far cry from people who ask God. This is a far cry from guys like Hezekiah who beg and plead with God to heal them from illness because of their faithfulness. This is a far cry from Nineveh who prays to God for forgiveness and repents of their sins. This is a far cry from Moses pleading with God for Israel and saying, change your mind because of the promise you made. No, this is Balaam coming to God and saying, I want you to change your mind so I can make a couple of extra bucks. Does God really care that much about your financial well-being? Providing for your needs, yeah. But is God so interested in us becoming rich? Not really. God's more interested in our faithfulness than our fiduciary status, I guess, financial status. And if there's any doubt that God is displeased with Balaam going to Moab, what we read next makes it clear. Verse 21. Balaam arose in the morning and saddled his donkey and went with the leaders of Moab. But God was angry because he was going. There you go. And the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as an adversary against him. Now he was riding on his donkey, and his two servants were with him. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, the donkey turned off from the way and went into the field. But Balaam struck the donkey to turn her back into the way. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path of the vineyards, with a wall on this side and a wall on that side. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pressed herself to the wall, and she pressed Balaam's foot against the wall. So he struck her again. The angel of the Lord went further and stood in a narrow place where there was no way to turn to the right hand or to the left. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Balaam. So Balaam was angry and struck the donkey with his stick. And the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she said to Balaam, what have I done to you, that you have struck me these 3 times? Balaam said to the donkey, because you made a mockery of me. If there had been a sword in my hand, I would have killed you by now. The donkey said to Balaam, am I not your donkey on which you have ridden all your life to this day? Have I ever been accustomed to do so to you? The donkey didn't make that hand gesture. He said, no. Then the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam. He saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed all the way to the ground. The angel of the Lord said to him, why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out as an adversary, because your way was contrary to me. But the donkey saw me and turned aside from me these 3 times. If she had not turned aside from me, I would have surely have killed you just now, and let her live. Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, I have sinned, for I did not know that you were standing in the way against me. Now then, if it is displeasing to you, I will turn back. The angel of the Lord said to Balaam, go with the men. Just speak only the word which I tell you. So Balaam went along with the leaders of Balak. Balaam saddles his donkey and goes to the leaders of Moab. It's a female donkey. We know that. That's the Hebrew word athon. But even though God said, sure, Balaam, you can go, he's still angry about it. He's angry, and he sends his angel to be an adversary. Fun fact, the word for adversary is the Hebrew word satan, which is sometimes translated Satan. Random fact. It's not Satan who's encountering him in the way, but it's that same idea, this adversary here. The angel makes 3 attempts to stop Balaam. First, he goes to the open field, and the donkey veers into the fields and off the road. That was easy to avoid. Second, we go to a walled road, so the donkey hugs the wall and pinches Balaam's foot, which I imagine aggravated him quite a bit. And the third attempt, it was so narrow, impassable, that the donkey just sits down. I'm not going around the angel this time. And so Balaam, what does he do? He beats his donkey. every time this happens, he beats his donkey. This donkey won't do what I tell it. There's a proverb in Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 10 that a righteous man has regard for the life of his animal, but even the compassion of the wicked is cruel. Balaam is one of those people who doesn't have very quick regard for the life of his animal. But of course, the irony of all of this is that Balaam is a prophet. He's a seer. He's supposed to be one who sees things. They can't see the angel. He's blind, the angel of the Lord. He speaks for God, but he can't see God's messenger. The donkey can see God's messenger. And so what happens? Well, God decides, I'm going to make a messenger out of the donkey. Because the donkey will make a better messenger than Balaam will. And he opens the donkey's mouth in what is the second of only 2 instances in the Bible where animals talk. The other one being in Genesis chapter 3 when the serpent speaks with Eve. I always thought it was funny. Every time in the Bible that people are talking to animals, no one is ever recorded to have been astonished at it or to think it's weird. I don't know why. I guess they just carry on the conversation. The donkey starts talking to him, and Balaam doesn't go, "Hey, who taught you how to talk?" No, he just talks back. Decides to carry on the conversation with this thing. And the donkey wants to know, what have I done? What has she done to Balaam to prompt being beaten these 3 times? If animals could talk, this one would wonder why you beat her unnecessarily. Balaam is angry that, in verse 29, he's angry that his donkey is making a mockery of him and threatens to kill her with the sword. Of course, he says, if I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you. He doesn't see that there's an angel standing right there holding a sword, trying to kill him. And the donkey says, I've never done this to you before. There must be a good reason today. At that point, God opens Balaam's eyes. Now he sees the angel with the drawn sword in his hand. Balaam had threatened a sword on his donkey, but the Lord actually has the sword to back up the threat. And suddenly, Balaam is met with fear. The angel echoes the donkey's words, "Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times?" Then the angel echoes Balaam's words, "If it hadn't been for the donkey, I surely would have killed you by now." Just as Balaam threatens his donkey with death, the angel threatens Balaam with death. Over beating your donkey? Over doing what God said and begging him for a few extra bucks? Yeah, over all of it. Because Balaam, you've missed the point. You've forgotten what being a prophet is about. Being a prophet's not about making a profit. The prophet thinks the problem is that the donkey won't listen to him. The real problem is that the prophet won't listen to Yahweh's messenger, won't listen to the Lord. Balaam confesses his sin here, verse 34. And he offers to turn back if God is displeased. Now, is God displeased? That much is obvious. Oh God, if you're displeased, I'll turn back. Do you think God is displeased, Balaam? Well, no, that's not the issue here. Balaam has forgotten what it says in verse 12, of course, where God said, "Do not go with them, you shall not curse the people, for they are blessed." But this is, more of the same, It's like when a parent tells a child no, and the child continues to challenge that decision. Well, I think it should be this way instead. Maybe sometimes God just lets us do the self-destructive thing that we keep begging Him to do. Just to see, see how far this gets you. The angel permits Balaam to continue in spite of all this. That's the thing. Verse 35, the angel says, "No, go with the men. Go to Moab. Just only speak what I tell you." And what's interesting about all of this actually is that everything between verses 21 and 35 could have fallen out of the Bible and you wouldn't have noticed it. You would have just seen the jump from verse 20 down to verse 36. So why even have this business with the talking donkey and the angel of the Lord and the sword and threaten Balaam with death? Why do all of that if you're not planning to actually change his course? It doesn't change Balaam's travel plans. It doesn't change there's no new instruction here because God already said, you can only say what I tell you. But there is a lesson here. The fact that Balaam is threatened with death shows what thin ice he's treading on. God sends his angel, the prophet, to impress upon him just how deadly serious the situation is. And more than that, the fact that the donkey speaks to Balaam is kind of an implicit remark here. Balaam, you're not so special. God can replace you very quickly if He really wants to. You think you're special because you're the mouthpiece of the Lord? I can use your dumb animal as a mouthpiece and kill you and let her live and accomplish all of the same things. Like John the Baptist would later preach, do not say to yourselves, oh, we have Abraham for our father. I tell you, from these stones that God is able to raise up children for Abraham. But then why let Balaam live at all? Why let the greedy prophet go on? Well, when God can use a dumb donkey to declare His words, He can use a greedy prophet like Balaam, a man with the worst of intentions, a man who the New Testament calls a false prophet. Because just as Balaam keeps trying to force the donkey to do things his way until God intervenes and says, this is the way it is, what's going to happen in chapters 23 and 24? Balak's going to take Balaam to 3 different locations and say, I want you to do it this way. And Balaam's not going to do it his way. The Lord's Spirit is going to come upon Balaam, and Balaam's going to say the opposite of what Balak said. And so much to the point that Balak's going to have to start yelling, like, shut up! I told you to curse them, and you're sitting here blessing them. I'd rather you not say anything. The comparison of Balaam to the donkey invites the question, who's the real dumb animal? Who's the real donkey in this story? In 2 Peter chapter 2, I want to mention a couple things. In 2 Peter chapter 2, I want to start reading in verses 12 through 16. These, like unreasoning animals, born as creatures of instinct to be captured and killed, reviling where they have no knowledge, will in the destruction of those creatures also be destroyed, suffering wrong as the wages of doing wrong. And here Peter's talking about just false teachers in general. They count it as pleasure to revel in the daytime. Their stains and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions as they carouse with you, having eyes full of adultery that never cease from sin, enticing unstable souls, having a heart trained in greed, accursed children, forsaking the right way. They have gone astray, having followed the way of Balaam the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. But he received a rebuke for his own transgression. For a mute donkey, speaking with the voice of a man, restrained the madness of the prophet. Balaam loved the wages of unrighteousness, but the mute donkey, well, God can give a voice to the mute even, to restrain the madness of the prophet. Balaam is the prototypical false prophet in Scripture. In Numbers chapter 25, an incident occurs where the Midianites start to intermarry with the Israelites, and a plague falls on the people. And it's just kind of passed over. They have to deal with the plague and the situation. But in Numbers 31, it is revealed that the true mastermind behind these intermarriages was Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel. Balaam was the one who incited this. Well, because in some weird, twisted way, Balaam knew that this would cause Israel, that a curse could come on Israel if he could get them to apostatize. And so what happens in Numbers 31? When Israel makes war on Midian, Balaam is killed for his role in the Midianite intermarriages. In Jude 11, he is compared with Cain and Korah. In Revelation 2:14, Balaam is called the false prophet who put a stumbling block before Israel to produce fornication and idolatry. Balaam is dominated by his insistence on payment, by his greedy motivation. He is the false prophet. And you want to know what? Here's the funny thing about false prophets. Name one prophecy that Balaam made that didn't come true, that we have recorded. You can't do it. And this is, I think, the mistake people make. They think, a guy who makes a bunch of false predictions and they don't come true, that guy's not a prophet. He claims to be a prophet, he's a false prophet. But you can be a false prophet and every word that's recorded of yours is still true. Because what makes Balaam a false prophet isn't what came out of his mouth. It's what lived in his heart. It's what motivated his actions. You can say all the right things. You can use all the right words. You can have all the right names on your signs. But if your heart is not right with the Lord, then we are nothing but false brethren before God. That needs to be where the emphasis lies. Because if our heart is not right with God, then all else is for naught. Because even the most vile of men have been used in history as unwitting prophets to speak God's truth. Think of Saul, who the Spirit of the Lord came upon and he prophesied in 1 Samuel 19. Think of Caiaphas in John 11, who prophesied unwittingly that Jesus would die for the sins of the nation. Think of that old man in Bethel who lied to the prophet of God from Judah, and then, while they're sitting at dinner, suddenly the Spirit of the Lord comes on him for real, and he prophesies, and he says, "You're not going to come to the grave of your fathers because you did not obey the Lord's instruction." False prophets, false teachers, it suggests they are defined not just by what they say, but what they do, by what they are motivated. And that could be any one of us if our motives are not pure. As we kind of come to the close of this, I want us to really kind of reflect, because the story of Balaam is, I think, really should force us to reflect on what motivates us. Are we motivated like Balaam? The riches of this world, the stuff, holding on to all that is passing away? Or are we motivated by the commandment of God? When we stand up and say, "You can't give me enough money to disobey the Lord," is that the final word we say? Or is it, "Well, but let me see if there's some way I can reinterpret this anyway"? You know? Not a good idea to try to reinterpret the Bible when you're emotionally invested in it. Are we more interested in our next big pay raise than we are in encouraging our brethren? Are we more fixated on securing a sweet chunk of a family inheritance than we are on things like kindness and fairness and the love of God? Are we more attracted by the latest toys and gadgets? I'm holding an outdated iPhone, but you get my point. The latest toys and gadgets than we are by simple devotion to the Word and prayer? Are we like Balaam, the prophet, who thought he could change God's Word because it would suit his financial convenience? You think that God's will just become different. God's will for me will just become different if I just wish hard enough that my life was easier. It doesn't work that way. You want to see the will of God? Look towards Jesus Christ, who, though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich. 2 Corinthians 8, verse 9. Thank you for your attention this evening. I hope that this has given us something to think about and reflect upon. I apologize for all of my intermittent hacking and coughing. But I suppose if the Lord can speak through a donkey and a false prophet, then he can also speak through somebody who's getting laryngitis or something like that. So thank you for your attention and for your patience. If there's anyone here tonight whose life is not right with the Lord and who is not following God's will, and maybe they've compromised in some way, or maybe they've just never put their life on the right path, now is an appropriate time to let that be known, to make it right. All together we stand and we sing the song selected.